Alright, welcome back guys. Lecture 2. So this is going to be actually using Photoshop. Again, I know that some of you may be familiar with Photoshop. Some of you have already used it. Some of you will be learning it concurrently in other classes. But I kind of want to just kind of jam through here and show you what it is important that or at least what I feel is important for you guys to work on or to understand about this program. So right here, I'm in the main screen of Photoshop. I am using Photoshop 2021. It is the most recent version. It's so recent that I didn't even know I had it downloaded, so I just switched from the other one between videos. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do Control N on the keyboard here. Am I on here? Alright, Control N. Okay, and that's going to open up the new window right here. And the other option is to click here on Create New, which will give you the same menu. So, all right, that's how you're going to start a new file in here. You can name it optionally when you start a file. I generally don't and just kind of save the file once I start working on it. That's entirely personal preference. They do have some document setup options here now, and I kind of want to go over some of those options because they are important. So if you are working in something, you know what your output is going to be, you might want to check through these options and see what you've got. So if I was to select web, it's going to default me to an artboard size here. These are common artboard sizes that you would plan to work on for a web project. So, basically screen sizes. This is your HD, full HD. What is that? I think that's just widescreen. This is old school, like super old school. Um, and then you've got all kinds of other things. This monitor that I have is like crazy huge. So you'll have all kinds of different sizes, but then alternatively, you can also just modify these numbers here. So again, our default unit that we're going to be working with here is going to be pixels, but you can change those values here as well. So if I want to change it to 1,000 pixels, I can do that. Oops, keep forgetting tab shuts my image off down here. Now the resolution, some students have asked me in the past what the resolution is for and why it's important. If I'm taking this image and I'm generating it here in the browser, or sorry, on a computer for a computer, it's generally irrelevant. When it becomes important is if I'm going to take this image and put it in something that is not going to be digital, all right? And so that's going to, if I set this resolution to a certain number of pixels per inch, if I was to then take this image and place it on an artboard for print, it's going to actually import at a different scale. At that point, it would be up to me to kind of rescale the size of that image. It's not terribly important for digital work, which is mostly what you're going to be working in initially. But when you start getting into projects where you'll be exporting it for print, it is pretty much critical that you kind of aim for, or at least understand what that's for. So the other option again here is going to be kind of these options that are destined for print. So I'm going to go to like US paper, and we've got our letter sizes. You could do something like 24 by 36, which would be a large presentation board. Now, this is where that resolution comes into play. 300 pixels per inch is kind of the standard size for print. If you know you're going to be working on something and you know that the destination is going to be to print, you'll want to set that so that you know kind of what a good detail level your images are going to come out on your board. The other thing you want to change, and we're going to get into this as soon as we get inside of the program, is the color mode that you're going to be using. So I talked in that previous kind of video about the different color modes. RGB is sort of the default environment for working on a digital environment, whereas CMYK right here is going to be the default for working on a print focused design, right? It does change how you see the image slightly, and I'll show you guys that. And then the bits here, it increases the color accuracy, but generally for what we're doing, for the level of technology that we are working with, and not having super fancy pants printers, anything but I personally don't believe that we will notice anything above 16-bit, and I generally just go with 8-bit because again, it's not that critical for most of the work we are doing. All right. You can set the background color here, but we will usually, kind of the first thing I usually do is get rid of that anyway. So let me go back and change this to, let's do web, and we'll do 1366 by 768 because that's a good default size. For a lot of laptops, that's starting to kind of be a less popular size. Maybe 1920 by 1080 is going to be kind of your more standard size these days. So either of those colors is fine, and then I'm just going to hit OK, and we will be in Photoshop in a second, or a few. There we go. All right, so within Photoshop right here, we have artboards now, apparently. Don't worry about that. Um, artboards are kind of more important for later. So we have this, and again, like I was saying in that previous lecture here, we have this space, and I'm going to click on layer right here to select this layer, and I'm going to zoom in here, and just like before, you can see here's a bunch of pixels, and if I zoom in really close, you can see those pixels are all very clearly defined there. All right, so now that we know that we're working with pixels here, what are the color options that we have? So we have kind of some settings right here in this area. You've got the two little tiles right here, and then there's this little kind of button that's the default, okay? What I'm gonna do is I can click on this right here, this little flippy thing, and it'll change which one's my foreground and background, which is what those refer to, all right? There are a couple menus where foreground and background color is important. You can hit X on the keyboard that will swap that, and if you hit this other button, it will swap back to the default, which is the black on top, white on the bottom. So you can see if I hit D on the keyboard as well, it does the same thing. The other thing that we're working with over here is going to be artboards, and of course this would be the exact lecture where they change this entirely, but if you're working in 2020, what you would more typically see is you would see a white default background, and then you would have to unlock this layer. So if you are doing that, hit me up, I'll show you how to get around that, but it looks like in 2021 we now have basically a fixed white background, and then we have a clear foreground that you'll actually work in. So, all right, some other tools. So let's actually, let's get into tools. So the first thing right here, there's this little brush looking tool, and if you hit B on the keyboard, that's what I've been using to work with stuff. Anytime you're working with the brush, for the most part, and we'll get to that in a minute, you'll be using that foreground color. So you can see that right now I have that black color selected, and if I draw in here, it's black. You can use the bracket keys. So those are the little, super bad at drawing that. Those keys right there, the ones to the right of the P. And if you hold down those, you can see that right here, my size of the brush that I'm using is going to change. And now I've got a great big brush now. I can also click on this little drop down arrow here, and I can change the size of the brush there. I have other options here as well, so I can change the hardness of the brush. And what that refers to is kind of, see how that has like a bit of a floaty edge to it. If I take that way down, you can see it's kind of blurry right there. But if I drag this all the way up, it gets a very hard edge to it, all right? There's a whole bunch of other brushes, and there's some pretty cool things you can do with them. That's going to open up in this menu right here. And you've got all these different kind of default brushes you can go in and play with. You can jump through the menus right here. So you can do size jitter. We'll turn on scattering, and we'll scatter both axes. Turn the count up a little tiny bit. And then let's take this. Let's see how that's coming out. So let me see here. I want to get a good one before I go on. Give me a second. Okay. So I just kind of jumped through a couple menus there. Got kind of a brush I wanted. So what I did is I have shape dynamics, So I'm going to do size. So each of these every time it draws it, it's going to do a unique tip here. And so with shape dynamics, it's going to slightly alter the size. So you can see that some of these are really tiny, some of them are really large. You can set a minimum diameter, you can set the angle so they'll rotate as you draw them instead of being all facing the same way. Scattering is what's going to make this group go kind of from that to that. So as you increase the scatter, you kind of increase that. As you increase the count, you get more of them, which kind of does weird things too. And then you do have options for texture. Most of these aren't going to be big enough that it's going to be important. Um, Dual brush, you can do multiple brushes at the same time. I usually don't do that myself, but it's an option. Um, Now this is what I was talking about when usually you were drawing with only the foreground color. You can do options where you do a foreground background jitter. So if I come in here and I'm going to click on the color options here. So if I double click on that, it keeps popping up outside of this window, sorry. So if I go in and I set this to blue for the foreground, you can see it says color picker foreground color, and hit OK. And right now it's in, don't worry about that, it's not terribly necessary. We are in an RGB color space. And then click on this other one, and we'll go to green. So now when I draw this, it's going to jitter between those two colors. All right. If I do 100%, you can get that kind of crazy thing. Whereas if I keep it more at like 2%, it's going to stay closer to that foreground color. So you can do some cool things with the brushes in here. You can do hue jitter where it just kind of ignores everything else and does that. You can do saturation jitter where it'll actually kind of just change the saturation of that. Brightness where it'll be just kind of go all over. So there's some cool tools that you can use here to create kind of weird patterns, backgrounds, and such. And if we scale this up super big, you can see that you get all kinds of weird stuff. Not something you will typically use in your projects unless you're trying to like make a quick piece of art to throw up as some temporary decoration in your SketchUp model. Sometimes it can be faster to just go, hey, I need some kind of weird image that matches my color scheme. So I'm going to do something that's, shouldn't have done that one. Let's say I need something yellow to go with the color scheme for some background art, but it needs to have a tint of orange in it. So I can do a little bit of that right there, and then maybe just do that. No, let's do that, and that's a bit too much hue jitter. There we go. So if you need some sort of random background pattern that kind of matches your design, you can quickly throw together something like that, save it as JPEG, and then I'll show you guys how to import this into SketchUp later as part of your drawing. All right. So those are the basic tools for that. Right. Okay. So the next thing is selection and editing. So up here, there's this little crawly box right here. It's the marquee tool. You can also click on M on the keyboard and that'll select it. And what this does is this was that selection tool I used earlier to kind of select an area and apply things to it. One sec. Doggone this. All right. So, all right. So with this selection tool, I can click and drag on an area. I apparently have fixed ratio set, so it's keeping it within a 960 by 540 area. That can be important if you're trying to do a image of a certain size ratio, but you only need a limited area, so it'll fix to that. But generally, you're going to be working with it in a normal area like this. You can also do select inverse to select everything that isn't the area you just selected, and you can hit delete, and now I've got this little area right here. Oops, no, stop it. There we go. Another option is you can select everything in that drawing and then hit V, and you have the move tool here. And there's a box up here that's auto select. It might be checked by default. And so if you have your whole artboard selected, and you can see down here that this has that patterned area, that indicates that there's transparency there. So with this empty area that I just cleared out and the area that I left there, everything selected, I can click on this with V selected, and now it's going to select just that area that I wanted, and I can scale this. And oops. By default now it's going to scale it proportionally, or you can hold down shift and scale it whatever way you want. So there's a couple different ways you can modify images in here. Alright, and then of course you've got to hit the little checkbox up there to complete that. So some other cool things you can do here that we'll be using later is the and this is the magic wand tool right here. Yeah. So the magic wand tool is a cool little tool where it will select things that are close in color to what you click on. So if I'm going to turn that selection off. So if I go back to my magic wand tool, I can click on that area that's too generic. If I take this tolerance down to something like 2, I can select just the colors that kind of closely match that, and you can end up with kind of weird patterns like that. So again, if you need to do kind of weird image editing, you need to get some sort of pattern to use for marble floors or something, that's a pretty good option right there. Delete that. Sorry, actually let me keep that there so we've got something to work with. So back to the move tool again. I don't have anything selected at the moment, and I can just, now that I have this auto select turned on, I can also just click on this and start moving this layer too. Move tool pretty handy for moving things around within the screen. We kind of covered the selection marquee where you can select an area and kind of move that around. We did, might as well cover this one. So the lasso tool, it's just another marquee, but instead of doing that fixed rectangle, this is something you can click around and then close off the area, and now you've got a selection like that. I find I don't use this one too often, but there are a couple weird edge cases where you might. And then the lasso tool is kind of a little just bit more freeform where you can drag the area that you want to select. Oops. To move it instead of doing a polygonal thing. So there are a couple different ways to select things between the marquee, the lasso, and the magic wand. Alright? Now, we kind of rushed through brushes there, but basically, let me deselect that. Let me fill this area back up again. There's a couple other things we can do with brushes, and so let me switch to this. So now I've got the orange as my foreground, and what I can do is I can turn the opacity down, flow down, and as I color with this, you can see that it's not really showing up there, but you can see that it's slowly having an effect. So you do have the option to kind of tone things down. And let me take this way down. We'll hit D and go back to our default, and you can see that still, because that flow and opacity is pretty low, we're not getting a whole bunch of effect there. But if I come back and do that, turn the opacity up, flow down, so you can mess with these patterns, you can mess with the colors, you can do all these other things with the opacity and flow to kind of freeform draw. Alright, so those are your basic editing tools for editing pixels. Now, when I'm doing this, I'm just layering pixels on top of each other. So as we talked about in that first demo, it was just there's one pixel in each spot, and each pixel has its value. So you can see that no matter what I do, I've only got one pixel, and anytime I overwrite that pixel, whatever value was there is changed. Alright? So what I can do now, and one of the advantages of using a program like Photoshop, is that I can go in and go to Layer, and then one second, they changed. I wish they'd quit changing this program every year. Alright, so Layer, New. My issue apparently was that I had Artboard selected down here. No, it's fine. I don't know what went wrong. Alright, so Layer, New, Layer, and this opened up off the side too. So adding a new layer in, we got layer 2, and you can see down here in the layers menu that this has now got this second layer here, and then I've got the original one I was working on behind it. So now I can actually start working on top of this, and I can layer these two things together. All right, so when I was drawing on this second layer, I can actually turn it off, and you can see that the original information that I was drawing there is still there. All right, what that's important for is that you can take images that you were working on, for example, the image that you would render for your project later, or a screenshot you might take, or whatever it is that you're working on, and then you can put things like entourage or whatever else on top of that. All right, and that's what we'll be doing for the milestone this week. Is we'll be taking an image, we will be isolating it, and then we'll be layering it on top of another thing. So again, one of the strengths of Photoshop and programs like it is that you can use multiple layers to create a combination of layers. Now, when these are layered on, or when the layers are stacked on top of each other, you can also have them interact with each other. So for example, I can tell it that this layer is going to be slightly opaque, just as if I was drawing it up here, but it's something that I can change on the per layer basis. All right. I can tell it to change the fill. I'll show you guys how that's slightly different in a minute, and it is slightly different, and it is important, but we're going to get into text first before we do that. So I can cycle through these options right here as well, and you can see that as I do that, that white layer is going to have a different effect on the layer behind it as it processes it based on what these filters are doing. So you can do kind of weird, crazy things. Um, Generally, you don't do these things, or at least we won't be doing these much, but I think it's kind of important that you do know that. And again, you can toggle layers on and off just by clicking this little eye that's right here. Okay. All right, so I mentioned text. Let's get into that because we're at 22 minutes and I'm trying to keep these under 20, so not so good. All right, final thing, text tool right here, T on the keyboard, and what you can do is just click inside of there and it's going to open up this text box. Let's see, so welcome to RD232. And so as I type that, you can see it's coming in with the Arial font. It's coming in with a white color. It's aligned to the left, 11-point font. And so I can go through, once I've got it, kind of like every other text editing program you're probably used to at this point. And we have a huge selection of fonts you can work with. So I can change the font. I can change, this one doesn't have any options there. Let me see if I've got, we got Lato, yeah. So some will have secondary options that you can cycle through. So for example, I can make this bold italic. And let's actually bump this up so we can even see it. And so now I can change through here, and it's going to slightly alter that text, but it's a secondary kind of modification. Let's close that too. All right, so I can also select parts of the text at a time and change their color, or I can select all of the text and change the color by clicking on that white box up there. Let's actually go back to black here because that'll be important later. And then, again, I can change the alignment, not too important for what I've got here. One of the cool things that you can do in here, this is a class. This class teaches Photoshop. Okay, so right now I've got 3 lines of text right here that I entered with that text tool. Again, pretty standard for a lot of everything. There's this little tiny folder right here, and if you click on that, it's going to open this character menu. And some of the options in here include, again, just what we were working with up here. So Lato, italic, font size, rendering. You can see that's all this kind of up here already. Some of the things that are important to look at here, though, is this option right here. So you've got the 2 A's on top of each other. This is going to be your line height. So sometimes you'll end up with lines where you want to kind of squeeze them together. You know, either the opposite of what you kind of did to get through papers where they had to be 5 pages or whatever. So I can change that line height right there to a specific value or to an auto value based on the font size. Or I can scroll through this. Let me reselect everything there. I can scroll through this and I can actually scale how tall this font is right here. Some of the other things I can do is I can change the spacing. I can change, let's look at that there. I can change the letter height. Some of these are kind of weird modifications and you're going to end up with some weird stuff afterwards. So kind of stay away from that. But just know that it is there in case you need to get some kind of weird lettering going on. Other options is you can do things like underline. So you can have underline added to the text. You can have subscript or superscript as part of that font as well. So sub is going to be, it's going to shift it down and make it a little smaller. Super is going to make it smaller but shift it up. And you can do cross out to do that. So there are a couple different things here that you can do to mess with the text. Be aware of those, but I'm not going to spend 30 minutes, 40 minutes going into them. All right. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show you guys before we kind of close this demo out, I'm going to click that check mark and apply that, is that when text comes into Photoshop, it's going to be its own layer. And one of the things you can use with Photoshop is going to be layer styles. So if I right click on that layer, no, oh, I'm thinking something else. All right, so if you go to layer up here in the menu, layer style, um, something that I find myself doing a lot when I'm doing designs is you need some sort of stroke or an outline that will help kind of differentiate your text from what might be a busy or chaotic background. So if I can go to stroke in here, there it is. What I've got is I've got the stroke, which is the thickness of that line, and I can bump that up a little bit. We can do position on the outside. Whoa. We can change the color of the stroke. Ooh, I like that green. Let's do that green. And then you can do blend modes, which are just like the other ones that were for the artboards down here. You can change the opacity. That's a bit thick. Let's go right there. And so this is done on a per layer basis. So I can move this text around, and then just like the layer themselves, I can turn these effects off and on. Okay. Um, the reason why I wanted to kind of get into this is because this is the same thing we'll be doing a lot of in Illustrator. So some of these same principles will apply when we get into that. It's just that Photoshop has kind of a bunch of different ones. So let's do something like a drop shadow. Come on, there it is. All right. So we can add the same thing, same idea, just kind of mess with the controls. And let's make that darker. So, just things that you can modify. That's kind of what I wanted to cover there. These are the basic tools that you will need to kind of get through Photoshop. And then I have one that's going to be the focus of the next demo. So, that should close this one out. We're almost at 30 minutes. So, I'll see you in the next lecture, and what we're going to do is we will be doing some actual photoshopping image editing. All right, so see you guys there.